Okay, the topic for this week and what I want to cover in this video is Finland and Finland's education system. This is going to be kind of a short, kind of glossy overview. I'll try to give a little bit more, allude a little bit to the complexity, but it will be kind of just a general overview. But the reason that I really like this reading is, to me, it brings together a lot of the topics we've talked about throughout the semester and kind of brings them together to close in kind of a nice way. So, one of the things, this is digressing a little bit or going off track, but I do like you to be familiar with the current Secretary of Education at the federal level and the state level. Obviously, these are both in transition, but I would like you to know that the outgoing Secretary of Education or state superintendent in Indiana is Jennifer McCormick. I've mentioned her before in class. She's a Ball State graduate. She's a Republican, and I think she's done a really wonderful job for the state of Indiana. Uh, the law has changed now, so the governor will, in his next term, will he'll select who the secretary or the superintendent of education is. So Jennifer McCormick will be outgoing. I thought she'd be an interesting consideration for President-elect Biden, simply because she would get confirmed. I would assume, as a Republican, she would get confirmed through the Senate rather easily, and it would just be interesting to see both parties kind of working across party lines, and just for a number of different reasons. And again, I think she's been pretty committed to public education, and she's shown a lot of integrity throughout her time as state superintendent. All right, so with Finland, the title of the piece we read basically is, what Americans ignore about Finland's education system. Finland has almost started a kind of like a tourism industry around their education department. They have people from around the world visiting there, interested in their school system. It's been brought up in a number of different contexts in the U.S., but I think sometimes different groups sort of cherry pick what they want to see in Finland. So the questions and things I want you to know about the end are, if they have private schools, the questions Americans are obsessed with, how they assess students in Finland, what their kind of overall goal is, and what's driven education reform in Finland since the 1980s. So, to give you some context and background here, Finland did not have a good school system back in I would say in the 1970s. Coming into the 1980s, they had low educational attainment. They had, limited opportunity in an inequitable system. They had modest, student achievement compared with other Scandinavian countries. Teachers who were not adequately prepared, and performance gaps with other developed nations. I think that what happened in the 1980s is that both the U.S. and Finland saw that the economy was changing dramatically. That manufacturing, for example, like we were moving in the direction of automation. Natural resources were changing. All those kinds of things. And so the economy had to change. That the social structure needed to change. And I think if you look at the U.S. faced the same kind of questions around that time. What we've tried to characterize it in class is that, the equality to excellence movement was the movement from a focus on equality to individual competition, things like that. I would say that the general sense is that Finland went in the direction of equality, and so when I asked you to kind of know for today what the kind of driver, the primary goal of education in Finland, it's been equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity, giving every student a chance to succeed or to be successful. And so, the changes didn't happen immediately overnight, but they began to change beginning in about the 1980s. And so Finland today, and the reason that people pay attention to Finland is that they have, they've really had the most consistent top performance in the world. Now, some of the other top performers along with Finland would be like Singapore, South Korea. Some will, there'll be some others that tend to appear in some of those top level. But I think that the reason Finland resonates with a lot of other countries is that culturally it aligns a little bit better. Like Singapore, for example, has a lot of pretty intense discipline, rote learning, long hours of memorization, things like that. So they tend to do better on the tests like the PISA. The other reason I think is that Finland also has really good outcomes in terms of like higher education matriculation. A lot of kids who go on to college, and they have a culturally much more relaxed system. I would really strongly encourage you. I posted a short video. It's only about 6 minutes on Finland on the Canvas site, and you can kind of watch, and it'll cover a lot of the same points that I'm going to cover. But they have shorter school days. They have than the U.S. They way less time in class. It's a much more culturally kind of relaxed atmosphere, especially too in the early grades. It does become a little more competitive. When you get into secondary education, teachers who are well prepared. You have to have a master's degree to teach in Finland. Equitable outcomes, and to give you an example of that, and one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize with the tracking that I forgot to cover is they got rid of their tracking system. They do not have tracking in Finland. Finland used to be very similar. In the tracking piece, I covered Germany and the way that Germany was very rigidly tracked with three specific different, like three literal different schools that you went to at a certain point where you're divided up. And you literally physically go to a different school based on where you place and where you're going to go to be prepared in terms of future employment and things like that. Finland did away with that. They have all kids kind of grouped together. Every kid has kind of what we would call like an IEP in special education, or an individualized education plan. So they have like a case manager, a teacher who looks at kind of where they're doing well, where they need to improve, and that teacher stays with them over a long period of time. So the system is set up to provide a lot of support, but they just let students go to class together. They don't differentiate. And I think they're always trying to improve their system. They did notice, I know about 5 or 6 years ago, they noticed that kids who needed special help were getting a lot of support, and had a lot of the kids who really excelled and really had strengths in certain areas. They kind of noticed that they maybe weren't doing enough for those students, so they changed and kind of devised ways to provide extra support. So they're constantly evolving and trying to change. And again, in terms of the top indicators of educational success in math, language, writing, and science, they've been at the top in all three areas consistently over a significant period of time. And they do intensely better than other countries, even Scandinavian countries. So countries that have similar demographics, population size, culture. Even in comparison to those other countries, they do extraordinarily well in comparison relative to those. One of the major focuses has been teachers in Finland. And to give you an idea of this, teaching has become really competitive in Finland. It's more competitive than law school or medical school. So if you want to go into teaching, there are more people that want to be in the field of teaching than in other professional fields, and they're treated like professionals. They're treated very well. They're given professional pay, prestige. I think they start out in a lower pay grade, more similar to the U.S., but over time they make on par what other professionals would make in engineering, and other professional fields. So they are compensated well, and a lot of respect. They go through a bachelor's degree program, and then they have to apply to get into a teaching program, and it's a master's program with a heavy emphasis on research. They tend to do a research project. And I saw a documentary one time I thought was interesting. The documentarian kind of pointed out the kids goof around in school and will test teachers a little bit. Like, they're still kids, they're still human, right? But they didn't really push things as far, and they didn't disrespect the teacher. They would end up, and I remember the person filming the documentary started asking some of the students about it, and the students said, we know what our teacher went through um, to get to this point, and so yeah, we might goof around and stuff, but we have a real strong respect for our teacher. And I think that's encapsulated throughout the kind of the culture in Finland today. Now, one of the interesting things, Paul C. Salzberg, who's mentioned in the piece we read and who's really an expert, he was at Harvard for a period of time. He's an expert on the Finnish school system, and was part of the design and development of it. He said that that his firm belief, based on a lifetime of research on this topic, though, is that if you took the U.S. teachers and Finnish teachers and swapped them into the different systems, that things wouldn't change. Like, we have quality teachers in the United States. It's the culture that allows those teachers in Finland. It gives them autonomy, gives them support, it gives them the things they need to be successful. Um, and so that's what's important to really focus on, is it's the system that allows, that brings out the best, I think, in teachers there. That's kind of the general feeling. To give you one idea of this that I really resonated with is that teachers there teach on average, I think, about 4 or 5 hours a day at most. Now they still have a standard work day, but they're not on their feet teaching for 8 hours straight. They're given a period of time. They're even given time throughout the week for professional development. So, like on Fridays, for example, they might have a half day of teaching, and then they're given a half day for professional development, to work on other things. So they're given a lot of time for planning and support, a lot of collaborative teaching, support within the classroom, things like that. And that, for me, that was something that really resonated, because I just remember, how exhausting and tiring sometimes, when you're on your feet all day in front of, trying to keep the lid on the energy inside of a classroom. Sometimes it can be a bit much. So it's nice that they kind of create that support for teachers. Again, they focused on equity and things like that. And to give you some comparisons, I kind of developed this to break down. I think we know the U.S., but to compare it with to Finland. So in the U.S., accountability, obviously, in the last 15, 20 years, this has been primarily in the United States testing, and has been one-way accountability. So it's really, and remember the way somebody I heard one time put it is that the U.S. approach has really been, we don't use it in any other context, but it's just to put pressure on teachers through testing. That's kind of the way it's been set up. But there's not accountability on the policymakers, administrators. The accountability is one way. It's only putting pressure on teachers. Finland does not have standardized testing. At least they have one test that's given to students around the age of 15. And it's just a general kind of way to see, like, how are we doing? They don't use it to punish teachers. They don't use it to rate schools. They don't use it to allocate funding or any of those types of things. It's just done as kind of a general assessment, like, how are we doing? The policies, the lawmakers, everybody involved. So, and I love a quote from the piece. It's, I think Paul C. Salzberg says, accountability is what you have when responsibility's been subtracted. And I think that you hold children accountable for things. With adults who are professionals, you expect them to be responsible. And so I like that focus on responsibility as opposed to accountability. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the cultural difference. Teacher preparation in the U.S. We've talked about how U.S. schools are going toward fast track systems, and there have been laws proposed in Indiana to allow business owners and people with different backgrounds to become administrators. So we've gotten, I think there's been a push away from traditional programs. In Finland, there's a focus on a master's degree, so highly prepared, highly trained teachers. In terms of school choice, this is another key point that I want you to know. I asked at the beginning, do are there private schools in Finland? And there are not private schools. Now, this with everything I mentioned, I would try to get into the complexity. There are, in fact, some semi kind of autonomous, somewhat private schools in Finland, but you're not allowed to make a profit from education in Finland. So these are not for-profit institutions. They've simply allowed, like for example, some universities have a long-standing traditional affiliation, maybe with a church or a kind of religious orientation, and they've allowed, in the same way that Harvard started, and Harvard's a private institution, they have allowed those entities to continue to exist. But again, you're not allowed to make profit, so you don't have the kind of expensive private schools that you have here in the United States. You don't have an equivalent. And the way that I've heard this put by somebody is that, and this is kind of interesting to contemplate. I don't know how realistic it is, but it's the idea that this person put forward was when you have all students go to school together, and when all people have to send their kids to the same schools, they're more emotionally invested in that school system doing well. And so whether you're wealthy or poor, when your kids all go to school together, you have to have an equitable, or at least a better system, and being emotionally invested in that system. And so I think that was kind of an interesting take on not having private schools in the way that we have them in the U.S. And then obviously, like, of course, you don't have things like the voucher system and things like that. Another good example, and this is something to point out that I really want you to know too, is that schools are funded equitably. So all schools are given, they have a pot of money, it's divided up, and then if your school has like language learners or kids with special needs, a little bit more is allocated. So it's equitable funding in the sense that schools are allocated the amount of money they need given the circumstances and situation they have. Instead of standardization, they've moved toward personalization. I've mentioned like the individualized education plan. Each kid has like a learning plan. They get to pick the courses they want to do. If you watch the video, you get to see examples of this. Like one of the little girls wants to go to work in one of the stores that they have at the school, and they're given the opportunity to do that. Another example that or way that I would emphasize this is Paul C. Salzberg. Again, I saw in an interview with him in a documentary, he was asked sort of about the ideas and how Finland got the ideas. And he says, really, what we did was we took the ideas of the progressive era, like, from the U.S. So the ideas of John Dewey and others were sort of implemented in Finland, basically. A more diverse and broad focus. They have a lot of focus on physical education, music is emphasized, the arts. And again, if you know through No Child Left Behind, what we've seen over the last 20 years of schools really kind of narrowing the curriculum, that's been a movement in the U.S. for a period of time. Finland's really broadened their focus on arts, music. Another good example of this is students in Finland will tend to learn at the very least 3 different languages, but a lot of them in high school learn a 4th language. So I think 3 languages is pretty much the basic or the basis. 4 languages, though, is common as well. No testing, really. And the important thing to and the clarification again and the complexity is not testing. I mean, they do a lot of assessment. I mean, that's a part of any good education system. They don't have the standardized testing. And the way to understand the difference, I think, would be, in the U.S., standardized testing tends to dictate what the curriculum will be. So you kind of have an idea of how the test is set up. You tend to teach to that test. That test dictates, to some extent, your pedagogy, but then also your curriculum. In Finland, the approach would be, the teacher would create the curriculum, and then they would create their own assessments based on that curriculum. Teachers and schools are given a lot of autonomy. Finland has a set of national standards, but I literally think it's 1 or 2 pages. Like, I mean, it might just kind of say, like, look, in general, kids by the time they get out of high school should know algebra or something. Or, it has some very basic kind of guidelines, but they entrust the teachers to implement. And there's a lot of focus on trust in Finland schools. Schools are given a lot of autonomy and support. Teachers own the curriculum, so again, they get to decide what they're going to teach. Um, I've heard teachers there say the one thing they really like about Finland is that, yeah, they went through a rigorous preparation program, and then when they were in the classroom, they got to implement the ideas and things they learned through that process. Again, a major emphasis on individuality, tailoring things to students' strengths and needs, avoiding deficit model thinking, which is something we talked about earlier in the semester, um, guidance, advice, and support. And again, there's often a lot of team teaching, support for teachers, pull out groups, things like that. And they track, again, each student has like a case manager that will track student performance over time. Another quick example, and a thing I love from this, one of the things that I've used it as a discussion topic previously is, Finland doesn't have grades through elementary school. And I always thought this is a really good thing to do. I mean, and it doesn't mean that they don't focus on how students are doing in student progress. Um, they track student progress, but they don't do it through grades. And as someone who worked in a program that didn't use specific grades, but did track progress, I thought that really forces you to kind of focus more on specifically, what students are learning, where they're strong, where they need to apply more, where they're doing really well, those kinds of things. And again, that focus on internal motivation, finding out what drives students, and focusing on that. So major focus on trust. Um, I like this quote as well. The first years of education are not about academic success. He says they're kind of about finding your passion, about, again, that internal motivation, um, what kids are motivated by. Um, I think I've covered a lot of these points. Again, like, in the piece, they talk about, Americans being obsessed with, like, well, how can you improve schools if you don't have competition? And what Finland has focused on is cooperation. And that's another important point to know, that there's a major focus on cooperation among schools, sharing ideas, sharing what works, working together. All schools are equitably funded. There are no private schools. I mean, I've heard parents say, like, look, we could take our kid to a different school if we wanted, but they're all the same. They're all good. They're all quality. There's no reason, like your neighborhood. One of the quotes from one of the documentaries is, your neighborhood school is the best school to take your kid to in Finland. So that's kind of the idea. Now, I thought I'd mention, another kind of discussion topic I've asked schools, students about is whether or not they think Finland is a viable model for the U.S. And I think, one of the kind of thoughts that come up is, well, when students are being mindfully critical, they think, well, Finland's a much bigger, smaller country. The U.S. is much, much larger, both in population and size. And then, we have a lot of diversity. And I think the answers to that, or the context for that, is that's a completely relative point. Linda Darling Hammond makes the point, or her idea is that Finland, though, could be a good model for states to implement, because a lot of our states in the U.S. are similar in population, at least size, to Finland. Now, we have more diversity in terms of second language learners and things like that. But Finland does have a population, a refugee population, a population of non-native speakers. Ours is just a bit larger. Theirs maybe is under 10%. Ours is closer to 20%. Um, but they have seen an influx of non-language learners, and they have remained competitive in terms of their, or it didn't have a major devastating impact um, um, on their school and their education system. And the other thing to remember is that their demographics are similar with other Scandinavian countries and their neighboring countries, and those countries have not seen the success that Finland has. So clearly, it's something within that they're doing within their system that's leading to the different outcomes. So yeah, it was never about excellence. It was about equality. I've used the example of like Norway as another country, that's close, that has not done as well. Um, Sweden, is another one where there are voucher programs and other things in that country, and that country has struggled in terms of educational attainment and things like that. So, um, again, not everything is as glossy sometimes as they make it seem. I do think schools in secondary education do get a little more competitive. They are rigorous. I mean, they're much more relaxed, I think, but it would be a mistake to not think of the schools as academically rigorous. Um, and so, yeah, there is complexity with some of these different things, but again, I do think it offers kind of an interesting model and an interesting um, focus for us. And the point that I wanted to come back to with focusing on equality of opportunity is that I mentioned LeBron James School, and one of the things LeBron James has done is implemented scholarships for all the students. And and when we talked about tracking, the other thing that I wanted to mention is I really think that schools in the U.S. would improve dramatically to me if ethically the idea was to get every kid at least to be prepared for college. That absolute, like, I know I hear all the time in Indiana that not every student needs to go to college, not every kid should. That's fine. Like, I would never dispute that. I think there are a lot of different paths for different people. As the state, Indiana does need to increase its secondary education and post-secondary education enrollment. Um, and I think culturally here, it's sometimes almost adversarial in a way towards higher education. So that, I think, needs to change. But I think schools would do better, at least if they got every kid to that door. And then when that kid got to that, to that option, they could decide which way they want to go. They could decide for them. I think, again, that's something that I think LeBron James School, the reason it's being successful is that that's a focus of his school. And I think other schools would do better. And again, I think that's one of the key elements in terms of talking about Finland is that equality of opportunity, that we just try to give each kid that equal chance to succeed. And what's interesting, I think the way that the author ends the piece we read is they say, to increase competition, to make the U.S. more competitive, maybe we need to focus more on equality in education. And so I think that's kind of an interesting perspective or way to think about it, that, sort of similar to, and I've in the past used the example, the NFL, the National Football League, like, it's kind of interesting because they do certain things, like they and other people would know that more about this than I would, but I mean, like, they take the TV revenue and they divide it up equally, or they, the last place team gets the first round draft pick. Like, they do certain things to help make it a really competitive environment. And so I think when you're talking about something like Finland, you're not trying to get rid of competition entirely or something. It's not about this kind of vision of um, eliminating all forms of competition. It's about, making things more competitive through creating a system in which, there's more opportunity, which ironically kind of takes that certain forms of equality, that the two can coexist together. So I hope this is helpful and helps clarify some key points, and I hope you'll get a chance to see the documentary I posted I think it illustrates a lot of the points that I've shared.